Well, we come to our question of the night and to our speaker. You may already know that 4 in 10 Americans think that religion does more harm than good. 4 in 10. There's been a 23% drop in church membership in just the last 20 years in America. According to some, Christianity will be a minority viewpoint in America in 15 years. It sounds implausible. For some, it sounds a worry. If only there were someone to help us navigate this question. It is my pleasure to welcome Peter Wehner. Pete, as many of you know, is a regular essayist in the New York Times and the Atlantic, two of the most influential outlets in the world. His insights cover politics, faith, culture, foreign policy, sports. He is a Renaissance man. He served in 3 U.S. administrations, including as the Deputy Director of Speechwriting for George W. Bush. He's the author of 6 books, if you include those he also edited, and he's the Senior Fellow at the Trinity Forum, which is a really interesting collective that's trying to promote the best Christian ideas, not to lobby the world, but to cause flourishing in the world. And he is perfectly placed to ask, and I'm hoping to answer, can Christianity thrive as a minority view? Will you please join me in welcoming Pete Wehner?
John, thank you very much. Thank you very much, John, for that lovely introduction and for all the great work that you are doing here. Congratulations to the prize winners for the Public Christianity Award. And that was a really moving video. Love has a name, and its name is Jesus. Amen to that. I do want to express my gratitude to Wheaton College for inviting me to speak this evening. I always love being on college campuses. Wheaton is among my favorite. There's a line that John Masefield said that university is a place where those who hate ignorance may strive to know, and those who perceive truth may strive to make others see. And I think Wheaton College is one in which, as an institution, and the teachers, professors here strive for truth and strive to help others see. To John, my host, thank you. He is, along with his wife, Buff, Australia's best import to America that I'm aware of. America is fortunate that this is a nation you now count as your home in this season of your life. I just want to thank Wendy Larson for all her help in organizing this event and for helping me to make my way around campus and coordinating all of that. It's also a real honor to speak as part of the Questioning Christianity lecture series, which is exploring and wrestling with questions that are exactly the ones that I think followers of Jesus should be wrestling with. And in this case, can Christianity thrive as a minority view? Let me begin by talking about the state of American Christianity in this century. You're familiar with the narrative. American society is secularizing, the percentage of Christians is contracting, and the United States, while some years behind Europe and Australia, is on the same path. Lower church attendance, a decline in Christian affiliation and practice, and a rise in religiously unaffiliated people. That description is true, but the trends for now have halted. Pew Research Center survey released last month shows the Christian population has been stable for several years, while the number of religiously unaffiliated people has leveled off as well. So today, 62% of adults in the United States describe themselves as Christians, including 40% who identify as Protestants and 19% as Catholics. As a point of comparison, in the 1990s, 9 in 10 adults in the country identified as Christian. Overall, then, this is what we can say. There's been a steady decline in American Christianity over the last several decades, but we've seen a story of stability over the last several years. So what does that mean? For starters, what might be called the age of Christendom in America is over. Churches and religious authorities don't hold anything like the position of honor or influence in America, the cultural dominance, the cultural hegemony that they once did. I should say that is true for virtually all domains and all institutions. If you survey the data over the decades, you've seen a collapse of trust in every significant institution, some less than others. The military is slightly more immune than others, but there has been this trend for a complicated set of reasons of a dissolving trust. But Christianity has certainly not been immune to it. As for Christians being a cultural minority, that's a proposition that can be debated depending on what aspects of culture we're talking about, what region of the country we're talking about, and even what branches of Christianity we're talking about, evangelical, mainline, or Catholic, progressive, or conservative. But we certainly don't see the triumphalism that we witnessed in the late 1970s and 1980s when the moral majority was founded. Indeed, over the last decade and a half in particular, the feeling among many Christians is that they're a moral minority, on the defensive, under attack. And in some quarters, many quarters, there's been a palpable near existential fear. So the wheel turns, the pendulum swings, times change. And whether Christians are a weakening cultural majority or an actual cultural minority, it's always good for us as a community of believers, as followers of Jesus, to ask and ask again, what should the Christian relationship be to our culture, to our politics, and to power? The answer is a complicated one. The privatization of faith and its complete separation from the public realm has a high human cost. Yet Christian engagement with politics and culture can have a high cost too. Sorting out the proper relationship between faith and politics is particularly difficult for Christians. For one thing, the canons of Scripture were decided long before participatory democracy existed. The authors of the Hebrew Scriptures in the New Testament did not anticipate a constitutional republic, checks and balances, and the separation of powers. So the application of faith to politics isn't obvious, and it's certainly not self-evident. There's also this. Unlike Muhammad, Jesus did not set out a political blueprint or an ideal of any kind. For Muhammad, the symbol was the sword. For Jesus, it was the cross, an emblem of anti-power. That has to play a role in how we think about power. In addition, Jesus' followers thought he would come as a conquering earthly king. Jesus had other things in mind. He lived within a Roman Empire whose existence he rarely mentioned. Jesus' main arguments were with religious authorities, not political ones. He proclaimed, he proclaimed a kingdom not of this world, a kingdom based not on an alternative political leadership, but on transformed lives. Yet Jesus, a Jew, was executed as an enemy of the state by Roman authorities. Contemporary leaders, political and religious, found his otherworldly kingdom threatening because it demanded obedience to an authority beyond their own. Jesus' followers were soon being executed for failing to show proper respect to the Roman emperor. In the Roman world, Christians challenged the political status quo on some issues, like infanticide. Christianity may not have laid out a blueprint for an ideal government, but love your neighbor has long had social and political consequences and implications. Christians in every generation have dealt with the same tension. They inhabit, in St. Augustine's words, the city of man, the flawed and fallen realm of history, government, and politics, while owing their allegiance, ultimate allegiance, to the city of God. This is a dual citizenship then, and it's difficult. Historically, when the faithful have exercised political power, They have sometimes been responsible for oppression and have brought discredit on the faith itself. But when the faithful have ignored political power, they have sometimes brought discredit on their ideals. Sins of omission can be as deadly as sins of commission. So the exercise of politics, as well as the engagement with culture, requires walking a tightrope. And often we haven't done it well. We need to name that. We need to own that. Politics is both a temptation and a responsibility. It can act like an addictive drug or a healing medicine. Craig Barnes, a former president of Princeton Theological Seminary, told me that when he was in graduate school at the University of Chicago studying church history with Martin Marty, a great historian who recently passed away, Craig was taught to seek simplicity and then to distrust it. What his professors meant was to look for interpretive themes in the church, past and present, and then humbly acknowledge that they don't always work. For example, according to Craig, a common interpretive theme is to claim that historically the church has functioned better as a critique of power, or as one speaking truth to power, than it has as one who has political power or social capital. This would make sense for a religion born out of a cross. And there are plenty of illustrations of this, both positive and negative, from the spiritual vitality of the persecuted early church, to the political and economic excesses of the medieval papacy, to the Amish community forgiving the man who slaughtered their children, and so on. However, there are times when the church had political power, and it handled it well. One example is Gregory the Great, a monk who was elected pope against his wishes in the late 6th century. And he called himself a contemplative, condemned to action. Gregory had to assume political as well as religious power. He sold church lands to buy food for the people and pay what soldiers remained, while also introducing new breakthroughs in spirituality, in mission, and in worship. In my own experience, I worked for President George W. Bush, whose Global AIDS Initiative, which at the time was the largest single program in history to fight a single disease, saved more than 25 million lives on the African continent. This initiative was a faith-based initiative in the sense that a number of the people who promoted the Global AIDS initiatives were people of faith. That was true of President Bush himself. It was true of Michael Gerson, one of the really esteemed, distinguished graduates of Wheaton, and who was my closest friend. And because of that, and because of what I've seen, I'm hardly indifferent to the good that politics can do. I'm also not indifferent to the damage that politics can do. So even now, I was on a call earlier this afternoon with people who are experts in the realm of PEPFAR and foreign aid. And the estimates are that probably 1.6 million people will die because of the gutting of PEPFAR. Now, it seems to me that that should probably stir the conscience of people of faith, but we all have to work that through for ourselves. I also have friends who have dedicated some part of their lives to deeply admirable causes, from fighting sexual slavery, to protecting religious liberties, to protecting unborn life. Those efforts make a difference, and that's important to acknowledge. But back to the past. Calvin and Luther wielded considerable political and social influence. The Anabaptists believed that this was an abandonment of the New Testament church, rightly understood. The Niebuhr brothers, Reinhold and Richard, wrote about political realism. Stanley Hauerwas and William Willimon wrote about the church as resident aliens that loses its soul when it accommodates to the political and social mainstream. Both Martin Lloyd-Jones and C.S. Lewis were wary of what Lewis called morals legislation, and Rob Dreher is an advocate for what he's called the Benedict option. Churches from the American North and South offered up to God competing prayers, and churches argued theologically and with great passion on both sides of the slavery question. The great historian Mark Knoll, who of course taught here at Wheaton for decades and is here tonight, wrote a book, The Civil War is a Theological Crisis, that's an excellent resource on precisely this topic. All of this is a reminder that, as Barnes put it to me, overarching themes for the church's historic or current place in society have to bow to the complexity of the church and its manifold manifestations. The more one studies church history, the more one is drawn to humility. I would add to the importance of humility the virtue of discernment. How to act in any particular historical moment is usually not self-evident. We can all quote Scripture for our own purposes, and we can all put out historical examples to support what we're determined to conclude. What all of us struggle with, to one degree or another, is confirmation bias, the tendency to look for information that supports rather than rejects our preconceptions, typically by interpreting evidence to confirm existing beliefs, while rejecting or ignoring any conflicting data, and the unwitting subordination of Scripture and our faith to other things, to ideology, to predispositions, to the culture and community we grew up in, and to many other things. If anyone tells you that they see things perfectly objectively, the answer is they don't, because they can't. Some of us, some people, are better than others in this realm, of course, but we all have astigmatisms. At best, we see only parts of the truth, glimpses here and there, now and then. As the Apostle Paul put it, we see through a glass darkly. It's helpful to recall that just because Christianity has lost cultural power does not mean it has lost influence. The sociologist of religion, Rodney Stark, has described how a tiny and obscure messianic movement in the 2nd and 3rd centuries became the dominant faith of Western civilization. He points to early Christians' communal compassion and social networks, their care for the sick, widows, and orphans, their welcoming of strangers and care for outsiders, their respect for women who were considered at best second-class citizens, and their connection to non-Christians. A longtime friend of mine, Scott Dudley, Scott and I went to school together, elementary, high school, college. He's now senior pastor at Bellevue Presbyterian Church. And he told me that being a cultural minority gives us a chance to go back to our roots of serving and caring. How Christians, including me, responded to the AIDS crisis in the 1980s haunts me, Scott told me. Had we, like the first Christians, cared first and cared most for the modern-day plague victims, I think we'd be in a whole different conversation with the LGBTQ community. We may still have significant differences of opinion. However, I believe the dialogue would be one of more mutual respect, and I believe the LGBTQ community would feel less afraid of the wounds Christians can inflict. But even if the conversation were not different, as Scott acknowledges, caring first and caring most for those victims of a plague would have been the right thing to do. A few other points to think about, courtesy of Pastor Dudley. For 300 years, the first Christians followed a certain paradigm. They cared for the poor, plague victims, orphans, widows, and created such an attractive counterculture that the movement grew explosively over 3 centuries until it became the dominant religion in the world. And then after that, the caring, serving, loving church became, in many instances, not all, but many, the persecuting, judging, conquering church. Christians lost their distinctiveness, their saltiness, and began to look like everyone else in the culture. The first Christians lived out an entirely different paradigm where loss was gain, where defeat was victory. Is that still relevant today? And if so, what are its implications? I don't know, actually, but it is an important question to wrestle with. The other thing that attracted pagan Romans to the minority and persecuted movement was the courage they saw in Christians who were willing to die, not just for their beliefs, but because of the genuine love and connection they had with the person of Jesus. In a classical world grown cynical, self-serving, and increasingly only focused on pleasure, according to Dudley, the courage, the independence of thought, and the grandness of the martyr's vision convinced many people that Jesus must indeed be the Lord, and there was indeed something good and pure in the world worth dying for. The other word for that is hope. And in a cynical age, hope is powerfully attractive. In his book, Playing God, Redeeming the Gift of Power, Andy Crouch makes a distinction between power as coercion and power as creativity. What Crouch does is demonstrate how Scripture calls us to discipline our power. Wielding power need not distort us or others, he argues, but instead can be stewarded well. People too often abuse their power and play God in the lives of others. Shady politicians, corrupt executives, and ego-filled media stars have made us suspicious of those who wield influence and authority. They too often breed injustice by participating in what the Bible calls idolatry. Yet power is also the means by which we bring life, create possibilities, offer hope, and make human flourishing possible. As Crouch's subtitle suggests, the key is redeeming the gift of power, recognizing that power can be an instrument in the pursuit of justice, but that it is also easily abused, including by Christians, and when it is, deep damage is done to the Christian witness. My friends Tim Keller and John Inazu, in their book Uncommon Ground, both praise and criticize America's Protestant culture that has influenced our founders and shaped certain middle-class norms for some part of our history. On the positive side, they mention, among other things, the vast majority of today's charitable sector, which has its roots in Protestant culture. But they also point out that this culture has often been indifferent to and even hostile toward the religious freedom claims of religious minorities. The very safeguards Christians are insisting for themselves, now that they feel under attack, are the kind of safeguards they were not so interested in when they were dominant in the culture. As John and Tim put it in their conclusion, the church has often been a more faithful witness when it lacked political power than at times when it sought control. Cherie Harder, a president of the Trinity Forum, of which I'm a senior fellow, told me that at one point in her 20s, it suddenly dawned on me why pride comes before the fall. It blinds. The problem with pride, prejudice, and privilege is that they distort and obscure one's ability to see reality and apprehend truth. The prideful do not see the pit or the snare. It becomes only a matter of time before they stumble into one or over the other. And conversely, the most searching, penetrating critiques often come from those who lack status, whose lowly status offers an unencumbered view. So there are advantages to cultural minority status. One is simply the ability to see more clearly. Profits rarely come from privilege. There are plenty of examples in Christian history when things went awry, when worldly power and dominance were snares, and Christian history shows that power, as we traditionally understand it, is not the precondition for being a faithful witness and a transforming presence in a society. Eugene Peterson wrote The Jesus Way, and he argued that the American church is enamored with the truth of Jesus, but ignores the methods by which Jesus embodied that truth. Christianity is obviously not just about affirming a particular creed or a set of dogmas, but following the ways of Jesus, modeling one's ways and means after his. That goes for every area of our lives, including politics and cultural engagement. According to Peterson, we can't suppress the Jesus way in order to sell the Jesus truth. The Jesus way and the Jesus truth must be congruent. Perhaps a time in cultural exile might be a time of reformation into the ways of Jesus. So what does it mean for Christians to be on the margins? And what opportunities are there for the Christian church as a cultural minority? We're certainly not used to thinking in those terms. Many of us have been conditioned to think only of the harm that attends the loss of cultural or political power. But there are other ways to think about these things. I asked Yuval Levin, a close friend of mine who is Jewish and therefore part of a minority faith in America, for his thoughts on how Christians might think about such things and what they might learn from our people of the Jewish faith. He told me that the inability to any longer see yourself as in possession of the institutions and cultural power and political power can actually be clarifying and empowering. To say this is our country should mean that we are part of a larger society to which we owe something and to which we can contribute something, according to Yuval, a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. But it's not necessarily to say that my way of life is dominant here, and that in that sense it is mine. And that forces you to try to be persuasive rather than demanding. Just to repeat that, it forces you to try and be persuasive rather than demanding. Yuval went on to say, when you try to be persuasive, you try to be attractive, and that also makes you more effective. It also helps you see what you owe neighbors. The Jewish Women's Volunteer has a motto that Yuval has always loved. We help people not because they're Jewish. We help people because we're Jewish. He thinks that's the right way to think about what it is we're offering as a religious people to a larger society that often isn't where Jews are. Yuval points out that being a minority is not the worst thing in the world, and it is certainly not the worst thing in America. Actually, much strength that can come from that. It enables one to be persuasive, which after all is what people who are trying to change souls want to be, and to see not only the loss of social power, but the potential persuasive power of speaking from a place where you say, I know you don't agree with me, but I think you should, and here's why they can strengthen you in ways that we should recognize. That's not to deny that some things of importance will be lost, but there is also a lot to gain in this kind of set of circumstances. Yuval also told me that an overriding social challenge of this period is isolation and loneliness, so religious communities should see that they have a special role to play in meeting people's needs. What religious communities can offer is not just a kind of philosophy of life, but community, united by a deep common commitment to the truth and a vision of the good. And I think religious traditionalists could see that this is what most are missing now. They need to emphasize the communal character of what they have to offer, because that is likely to be especially attractive and powerful. What Yuval means by this is we should be far better and more effective. We would be far better and more effective if we spoke about what's at the center and what it is we seek to protect, to portray what we love in a way that is more beautiful and more attractive. So let me conclude by returning to the question posed in the title of this lecture. Can Christianity thrive as a minority view? The answer is it absolutely can. Historically speaking, it absolutely has, and it may even be best when it does. But at the end of the day, when all is said and done, the key for Christianity to thrive or not isn't whether it's a minority or a majority view. It is whether those who claim to be followers of Jesus really and truly love Jesus. The affections of our hearts set the direction of our lives. And so we have to ask ourselves, are the affections of our hearts the center of our emotions, desires, and motivations, the things that we love, desire, and find pleasure in, centered on Jesus, even if it's imperfect? If the affections of our heart aren't centered on Jesus, and all sorts of things, greed, ambition, and anger, clericalism, hypocrisy, a lust for culture wars, will find a nesting place. If the affections of our hearts are centered on Jesus, it's unlikely that other things, worldly things, will find a permanent foothold. To paraphrase Malcolm Muggeridge, as followers of Jesus, we are called to be shining lights in a dark time, a living embodiment of Jesus' love in a cruel time, and the embodiment of grace and truth in a godless time. If we do, of course not everyone will be converted to our faith. But even those who don't believe in Jesus will in many cases wish they did. Like a person who is colorblind, they may long to see the beauty and vividness and enchantment of a world filled with colors and with wonder. Thanks so much for your attention, and I look forward to the conversation. Over here.
Thank you so much. So we have Q&A now. All you need to do is go to the aisles. You'll see the microphones there, and you can ask your question. So make your move. Don't leave it to the last minute. Otherwise, I'll keep asking questions, and it's much better when you do. But while you're moving to the microphone, can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
So at points, I felt you were sort of saying the cliche, Christians with power bad, Christians without power good. But you kept on saying you weren't saying that.
Right.
Is the difference... your last 3 minutes was when people's affections are set on Christ, it doesn't matter whether Christians have power or not. They can do great things with power, they can do great things without power. Is it as simple as that?
Yeah, I could have made the speech in 3 minutes, it turns out. But I think that is right. I think in my experience, both literally my experience, but also in what my sense is of Christian history and conversations that we have, people tend to have a tropism toward one or the other, which is we need power because with power we can do so much good. And if we don't have power, we're going to suffer and our ideals and our values will suffer. And that can be true. And the other one is, within church history, which is the seductions of power are so great, they almost always win out. And my sense of Christian history and what I've observed in my own life is it's a mix of both, and both can happen. I do think that as it relates to Christians in power, it is important that we be alert to the history of it, and to be honest about our own the temptations that we have and the misuses of power. It's C.S. Lewis said that in a flood you don't need people reaching for fire hoses, right? You have to understand the context in which you live. I would say that for this period and for this generation, if I had to raise the stronger of the two concerns, I think it would be to remind Christians, A, that they don't need power to succeed, and secondly, that there are a lot of trappings to power. We were talking earlier today, but Chuck Colson, who was an advisor to Richard Nixon and a ruthless advisor before he had his conversion experience, which was a very real thing, once said that the group that was most easy to seduce in politics were Christians, that they just basically needed a picture, I'm paraphrasing, but they needed a picture with the president to come in, and that was it. They were won over, in part because they were longing so much to be in power or to be acknowledged by those in power, and I think we can pretend and tell ourselves that we're largely immune to that, and I think the reality is that we're not.
Thank you. Our first question.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. So my question is, as you know, while there is a rising secularism in America, there's also a growth in religious diversity. And so I appreciated you bringing up the example of your Jewish friend and the way that you kind of have interacted with him and learned from him. I would love to hear more in that vein of just how do you think that we as Christians can be in dialogue with and learn from religious communities who have always been a minority in this country?
Yeah, it's... I would say that in my own experience, once you make those connections with people, it's really a matter of curiosity. And I think Christians just do better. I think people in life in general do better when there's an authentic curiosity to learn about the experiences of others. And that's true of faith and true of other realms of human life as well. And just because there are people who have a different faith perspective than we do doesn't mean there's nothing to learn from them. And, Yuval has been in different groups with me, including a book club that is predominantly Christian. And as I said, Yuval is Jewish, and he's completely comfortable within that. In fact, sometimes his insights are the best on faith-related matters of anybody I know. I used to be a colleague with Yuval at Ethics and Public Policy Center, and I used to go into his office from time to time and ask him questions about Christian theology or doctrine. And he would always begin by saying, look, I'm outside of my depth. This is not my area of expertise, but this is how I see it. And then he would give me like 2 beautifully articulated paragraphs of an insight. And I appreciated it because A, I learned from it, and B, I could steal it without ever worrying that he would use it anywhere. So I think that there is a lot to learn from people in all sorts of realms, and you take what's relevant, and you don't necessarily absorb what's not relevant to you. But there are commonalities of human experience, and I really did find it helpful to say, look, here's a person whose faith is a minority, and what does he make of that? So. Many of my closest friends are people of other faiths or of no faith at all. And having those conversations has enriched my life in a lot of ways. I don't find myself dispositionally oriented toward arguing with them or trying to even to advocate a set of apologetics on my faith. I think it's more, I'll put it this way, I do think in my experience what has most reached the lives of people who are non-Christians is when they are in community with people who are Christians and show them something different than what the caricature may be. I have a good friend, John Roush, who's gay atheist Jew, and there's a Zoom call that we have, and I had invited at one point Tim Keller. It's a really eclectic mix: rabbis, Swedenborgian, Protestants, theologians, writers, and so forth. And I had invited Tim Keller, who I was good friends with, to be part of that. And John never met Tim in person, but got to know him through those exchanges and Zoom conversations. And when Tim died, John wrote a tribute to Tim in the religious news service. And he said that he grew to love Tim. And it was such an unlikely friendship and such a beautiful friendship and such a powerful testimony. And one of the things that John told me was when he asked Tim, what about theodicy? How do you explain theodicy? Which is basically how does a good God allow evil? He said that Tim told him, I think I can get the bucket filled up 3/4 of the way, but I can't get it all the way there. And that really registered with John. It was a sense that there's some measure of humility, some sense that I'm not the receiving end of a series of talking points, but this is someone who's actually engaging with me. So, unlikely friendships can be beautiful things.
I think we saw a brilliant example of that in James McGraw's winning video.
Yeah.
The willingness to acknowledge doubt and flaw and foible.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming tonight and for sharing these things. I have seen things that I never thought I would see in my life. I am sometimes I really, being a Christian, just being there is God and there is Jesus Christ, if I didn't believe it, I would say everything's going crazy. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I feel like I sense, and I want to say this the right way, but I feel like the devil has created a pincer move. On one hand, you have the left and whatever, but on the right, and a lot of people, whether it be the nationalist view or just, it's based on a whole sense of pride and self-righteousness and even further. And some people, I've never heard them go so far as, even unbelievers are saying, Christians need to read the book of Revelation. What? but they almost think that that's where it is. And it's almost like, I mean, trust me, I am no charismatic or whatever. I consider myself anti-charismatic, but I feel, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, that it's really what I see like I've never seen before. It is a battle between freedom and bondage, between the common person and the elite. And there is a rebellion going on that I have never seen, and it's crossing countries. I mean, when I hear that people in your country say, I'm embarrassed, I'm ashamed, something is crazy. This is something, and I almost feel like Christians, I don't know how you do it, but it's some part of us have to divorce ourselves from this side and this side and say, no, Jesus and God is here. Because people on this side are looking for a non-political Jesus. And I'll leave this with this illustration. There is a guy who does videos on YouTube, and he's from Tennessee. And he said, you know, I love Jimmy Carter because he lived his faith. And trust me, he may have issues. He says, but I have gotten comments, people that say, you're going to hell. You know, I thought the church was supposed to reach out to people. And he would be a wonderful, I see a lot of people that are atheists now, that if Christians were not so judgmental, and I'm not saying we don't be judgmental at sin, but they look at Christians and they're people on the left, they're people that no longer believe, and they say, I don't want this Christianity. And the sad thing is, I feel like on the right, there's a lot of people that the left says, that's Christianity? I don't want to be, I mean, I'll be honest, if I didn't know Jesus.
Sir, can I ask you to pinpoint a question that we can put to Pete
I see.
so we can hear his
So
views?
the question would be, how does a Christian balance this craziness? Because it's craziness.
Yeah. No, thanks.
Thank you.
And I understand. I hear the passion in your voice and the sense of, of feeling wounded. So I get all of that. I'd say a couple of things in response to it. One is it may be helpful, it may not, to put things within a historical perspective, which is the history of Christianity is pretty mixed. I think we like to tell ourselves it's almost, an unmitigated chain of kind of glory and goodness. And we like to talk about where Christians have been on the right side of all sorts of movements throughout history. And in many cases it has, but in many cases it has not. This is an unfolding story. It's a beautiful Savior with a broken people who are following it. I would also say that, and this is true of me too, and I think it's probably true for a lot of you, I think we end up subordinating. I think when we talk among ourselves, we speak because we both honestly believe this and we want to believe it, which is, as followers of Jesus, Jesus is the most important thing in our life. I think in reality, he's often not the most important thing in our life. I think often there are core identities that we have that are more important. And what we do, and we play games with ourselves, it's the nature of human psychology, which is that we take these predispositions or these views or these habits that we have, and we tack on Christianity to baptize it, to sanctify it. So I'm doing this in the name of Jesus. People have done a lot of really, really ugly stuff, in the name of Jesus. I do think it's helpful when you're seeing these things happen on a macro level to kind of go micro and to find people to the degree that you know them and are comfortable with them, which is to ask them, tell me your story if they disagree with you politically. Tell me about how you came to believe what you believe. In my experience, and I don't always model this, I promise you, the times that I have done this, it's a world of difference when I have people who are different. And it's true of politics, it's true of faith, it's true of other arenas, which is if you have an authentic interest in what people are like and how they've come to be who they are, that matters to them because they feel seen and they feel heard. And what happens is the defenses begin to go down. And then there's a kind of vulnerability, even an admission to be able to say, I am kind of struggling with this, or I'm not comfortable with this. What people don't like is if you try and overwhelm them with a set of facts or a set of arguments, because people feel under attack. And often what you're going at is not just an issue, but a core identity, right? The issue is a manifestation of something deeper. And whenever any of us are under attack, our core identity, our impulse is to lash out and to strike back. And then, the last thing I would say is that we as Christians are ultimately called to be faithful, not necessarily successful. That's for a higher pay grade than us. And we can't control it. None of us in this room can control how national and international events are going to unfold. What you can control is the world in which you live in, the communities you have, the relationships you have, the integrity with which you lead your life, the way you lean into the lives of others, being there at times of sorrow and grief and joy. And that it's really done a person at a time, a community at a time. And then it happens as a country at a time. But I tell myself, because I have anxiety for sure too at this moment, which is that we're citizens of a city that human hands didn't build and can't destroy, and which is everlasting. And that's kind of our story, and we need to claim it.
Thank you, sir.
A couple preliminary comments. First, Pete, I want to thank you for your distinguished public service. You modeled for me as a professor here how to integrate Christian faith and public life. And for 45 years, I sought to encourage my students to consider public vocations, and you and Mike Gerson and Mark Hatfield and others were examples of the kind of faithfulness that can be manifested in politics and public affairs generally. My question really is not about politics, but is about culture. Politics is downstream from culture, and the major challenges that I think the churches face and institutions like Wheaton College face is, what does it mean to be authentically Christian in a culture that is undermining core elements of faith? Do you have any suggestions for Wheaton College and other Christian institutions, or for churches generally, as to how they can address the rampant secularism, materialism, relativism that pervades our culture?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Mark, for those words. They're very meaningful to me because of my respect for you. And I'd say, as a general matter, I do agree with you that politics is downstream of culture, except when politics is upstream of culture, which happens, right? So that's the synergy, because sometimes politics, the nature of politics, has a real power as well. But as a general matter, I agree with you, and it's actually, I think, an old sort of conservative truth in it. Yeah, how do you remain authentically Christian while one feels like that these Christian ideals, values are being undermined? I mean, there's no real book that you can pull off the shelf, I think, for a couple of reasons. One is that kind of every situation is sui generis. It depends on what is the issue at stake, what's being fought over. and trying to discern, is this a major or a minor issue? Where does this fit on the spectrum of faith? Can we disagree and still be in fellowship, or are we talking about, if we disagree, kind of a breaking of fellowship? Is this issue, whatever the issue is, a real attack fundamentally on Christianity, or something more on the periphery? Then there's just the institution that you're a part of, the moment that there is, and what's required in that moment. Is it a defensive maneuver where you're just saying, look, we've got to kind of hold on and survive, or is there something in which you can actually make advances? And I know, because I know Christian colleges and institutions all over the country are dealing with a lot of complicated issues, which have a lot of passion. I do think that in the end, the best that we can do is to try and conduct ourselves with that sort of ancient duality of grace and truth, and to try and articulate the truth as best we can, and to try and do it in a way that radiates a measure of grace, and doesn't make the people with whom you disagree feel like they're under attack or that they're enemies. And as I said earlier, that they feel heard. But and also I would say that we have to be careful, because the history of Christianity is a conviction that some particular point of view is absolutely central to Christian doctrine, dogma, and then it's not. And it was true of geocentrism and heliocentrism. It was true of slavery. I mean, Jonathan Edwards said very directly, the Bible validates slavery. There are a lot of things in history, in Christianity, which we have to be knowledgeable of with this kind of epistemological humility, which is sometimes what we think is absolute Christianity is shaped by certain cultures, right? So you go to different cultures and you hear different points of view. That's not an argument for relativism, but it is, I think, an argument for epistemic humility as well. The final thing I'd say about it is, if you're at an institution and you believe, it's the same thing of working in an administration, if you think an institution is doing something that is a violation of conscience or a violation of integrity, I think then you just have to leave, an institution. And if an institution feels like it's being asked to do something that simply is a line that they can't in good conscience cross, then you have to find a way to remove oneself. I just would not want to be in a position of telling people, go against your conscience or what you think is right, if you really deeply believe it to be right, to maintain power or, money from federal government or anything else.
We'll take 2 more questions, beginning, of course, with Alex. Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Peter, for the talk, and thank you for coming to campus and for your responses thus far. Alex Haskins, I teach politics and international relations here at Wheaton College. Just more of a pastoral or shepherding question, not a political one, even though I teach politics. So I'm wondering, particularly as I engage with students here at Wheaton College, many of whom have a very strong evangelical witness, right? I mean, we are an evangelical college, whether that's coming out of Matthew 28 or other passages, right, the Great Commission, who might wonder this question and then your answer to the question, if this is somehow compromising our evangelical witness. I mean, we're not necessarily about numbers, but every soul that's saved is a good thing, I think, right? And if we see more people in the world being Christian, isn't that a good thing? So how would you advise sort of students or maybe staff or faculty who are wrestling with this question, maybe even your answer, that the church historically has, and maybe we'd be in a better position if we were, and wrestling to sort of bring that together with the Great Commission, bring that together with a sort of desire to see lost souls saved?
Yeah, sorry. Could you? The question is,
how would you sort of mentor or pastor or shepherd someone wrestling with maybe what they perceive as a tension between this question and the Great Commission?
Yeah, in terms of how to how to wrestle with it. So you refer to it as the tension of the Great Commission. I guess what I would say is, to the degree that we can view other people as human beings with complicated life stories, and to try and enter into their stories, and to lean into their lives, that's been, in my experience, the best way to enhance the Great Commission. It's not the only way to do it, and I should say too that, when my journey of faith started, and it wasn't an easy journey of faith, and I didn't grow up in a Christian household, it was very important for me to nail down sort of certain historical truths, the crucifixion and the resurrection in particular. So I did a lot of research on those questions before I felt like I could comfortably come to faith. And then I grew up in an age and era in the 1970s and to some extent the 1980s where apologetics was kind of a big deal. I think apologetics is different now than it was when I was younger. And I think there are less intellectual questions and more, how does this affect my life, or what does it mean when I see Christianity or Christians acting in ways that are contrary to that. I will say that in terms of my own witness, and that's through my life and often through my words, in writing for the New York Times and the Atlantic on faith questions, I think the way that I kind of approach it is, this is how I understand faith. This is how it's meaningful to me. This is what it's brought to my life. This is what I struggle with, apropos that wonderful video that we saw. The authenticity of that, the fact that you don't want people to feel like you're reading from a script, but you're actually trying to convey your own life experiences. But in the end, this is, in my case, how I came to be a follower of Jesus and to love Jesus. That, I think, is the most powerful witness of all, and it's also the best antidote, I think, to people who either have caricatures of Christianity or real and genuine concerns when they look at it and they see this macro events unfold, and they think, look, this is a joke. This is a moral freak show. You guys aren't serious about this. And I've met plenty of people like that. When they begin to meet actual Christians who they believe that those people have lives of integrity, and that it adds some dimension to their life, that makes a difference. Just one quick story, and then we'll take the last question. One of my mentors growing up, when I went to college, was Steve Wehner, and Steve was at University Presbyterian Church in Seattle. And he ran something called The Inn. When it started, there were like 30 people that went. When I went to UW and went to The Inn, there were like 900 students that would go. And Steve later became president of the university and then Columbia Theological Seminary. He was a person of tremendous integrity. And so at every key moment in my life, especially during hardships, Steve would be the person that I would go to. And I just had such a deep trust for him and love for him. And he died of pancreatic cancer, as did Tim Keller, and Steve died in 2015. And I mentioned earlier John Rausch, who again is gay, atheist, and Jew, so this is not a person who was inclined to be friendly toward faith. And Steve wrote about his journey toward death on the Caring Bridge site. And there was one set of reflections that he had. It turned out hundreds of thousands of people who didn't know Steve, just began to visit this Caring Bridge site because he was so authentic and faithful in what he was describing. And there was one of his posts he put up, and I cut and pasted, and I sent it to John. And I said, I thought this would interest you. And he wrote me back, and he said, when I see people like this, people of faith, manifesting so much grace, and joy, even in the midst of suffering. That's when I wish I could believe. And it wasn't a set of arguments that convinced him or that touched him like that. It was a human life. And at the worst moment in a person's life, which is when they're about to enter into death, to be able to say and show this thing is authentic, and I'm a different person because of my faith, and I'm a person who has more fulfillment, more joy, more peace. That's the one thing, and grace. That's the thing that in all of the din, if you want to break through, those are the elements in my experience that really reach people. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. I just want to say first, thanks for taking the time to discuss these things with us.
Sure.
I was curious about one thing you were talking about, like just because like Christianity like loses its cultural power, that doesn't mean that the church has lost its ability to influence.
Yeah.
And I feel like the church, I've grown up like from my parents, I've understood that the church should be influencing the culture and not the culture influencing the church. And yet it seems more and more that culture these days is having a greater influence like in the churches than the other way around. And just a lack of backbone a lot from churches on like certain things. There seems to especially be an extreme emphasis on love in churches and making everyone feel comfortable. And sometimes this involves avoiding addressing certain difficult issues in order to make people feel comfortable and like to be like more ecumenical. And I guess my question would be, how can the church still have like such an influence if it's struggling in its resistance against being conformed?
Could you say the last part again? How could the church be
How can the church like be super influential when it's struggling in its resistance against being conformed?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. Thank you. It's well expressed. Now I understand where that perspective is coming from, and I understand why some people feel like the church hasn't had enough backbone. I'd say in some cases there's too much backbone too, and it depends kind of on the church and the times in which one lives. There's no magic formula to this. I mean, it's a complicated question because you really would have to get into the particulars, right? My hunch is that behind that question is sexual ethics, probably a large part of that. That's a big concern of which evangelical Christians, understandably, have concerns. But it could be other things as well. And I know that the idea ideally would be for the church to influence culture rather than culture influence the church. I think what I would put as a rather large caveat on that is that I think you could make the case, at least I would make the case, that these days the church is influencing culture in a lot of ways that makes culture worse, not better. And I think what we have to be alert to is as we examine ourselves, right, which is what are our predilections, what are our predispositions, what are our tropisms? Because I think a lot of times what happens is we have a certain tropism, certain orientation, one way or the other. It may be to sort of conform to the culture, to the trends of the culture, to give up the fight, to be trendy, I don't want to be judgmental, I don't want to be this, I don't want to be that. And that plays itself out theologically. See, what I think happens a lot of times is we think our tropisms are shaped by Christian faith, when what happens is our tropisms shape our Christian faith, and they shape our view of doctrine. And other people, on the flip side, have a certain tropism towards a harshness of spirit, a certain judgmentalism. They are what's referred to as kind of heretic hunters. They're on the prowl. And that happens too, and that can be destructive. And so I think part of what's important is to have people within one's own life or one's community, and even self-reflectively, to say, well, what honestly is my tropism, my orientation, my disposition, and then to try and think, how do I balance, against it. It's interesting in my own study of the Bible, and John would know this vastly better than I would, and Mark and others, here. But one of the really, really interesting things to me about the Bible is how multivocal it is. And, Shakespeare said rightly in The Merchant of Venice that the devil could quote scripture for his own purposes. And of course, the first great proof texting war was what? It was Luke 4, right, with Jesus and the devil. So the devil is quoting Psalms, and Jesus is countering with Deuteronomy. And so what's the point of that? The point is that if you go in, you can find any verse to justify virtually anything that you want to do. And I think we just have to acknowledge that and to say, in a way, the measure or the test of this is the centrality of the character of Jesus, and is that, when all is said and done, the thing that's being projected. And Thomas Merton, Catholic monk, said that lovelessness cannot be what in the end is Christianity. So I think we have to be alert to those things, and probably also to think through as we process, if we feel like we're encountering opposition or the culture is against us, what does that elicit in us? Does it elicit anger and resentment, and I'm going to get even with these folks, or does it elicit feelings of pain or sadness because we think that something is prevailing that's going to hurt, human lives? So a lot of this is just trying, as I said earlier, to kind of mix with different people. And we all have blind spots, and they're called blind spots for a reason. And so we need to surround ourselves with people who are able to see what we may not be able to see. And then we have to be, in terms of our own disposition, opening to hearing, giving people an invitation to say, is there something in my life that I'm missing, that I'm off, and and to take that seriously. But we're all a work in progress.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Our next Questioning Christianity is in just 2 weeks, and some funny Australian ancient historian is giving a talk on resurrection, fact or fiction, to get us ready for Easter. And I want to approach this question as a historian rather than as an apologist, and ask the question, how seriously can secular historians take the evidence for the resurrection? So I hope you'll come to that. In 2 weeks from now, there's a flyer available. Until then, will you please thank Peter Wehner?
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks for your attention. Thank you, John. Thank you. Thanks.